Winter 1944, the Ardennes front, Germany's last gamble. The forest is silent except for the sputter of an idling Panther engine. Frost smokes from its exhaust into the pale dawn. Snow blankets the Ardennes like ash over a dying fire. Along a narrow road, a column of German armor sits motionless, steel giants frozen not by fear, but by emptiness. The fuel trucks never came. Inside one tank, a crewman breathes into his gloves, staring at the thin gauge needle sunk below zero. "Noch kein Benzin," the radio whispers, still no fuel. Outside, officers argue in low voices, ration maps spread over the hood of a staff car. The plan that promised a breakthrough to Antwerp now drowns in arithmetic. Miles per gallon, barrels per division, hours left before the engines die. The men still have guns. They still have courage. But the truth has already written itself across these snowbound roads. It isn't the weapon that wins a war. It's the line that feeds it. As dawn breaks through the trees, the camera pulls away from the stalled armor, rising above the white forest toward the factories, railways, and ports that truly decide the fate of nations. The hidden arithmetic of war, Germany's fragile foundation. In the years before the world caught fire again, Germany stood at the edge of triumph and bankruptcy. The Treaty of Versailles had disarmed its armies, but not its ambitions. By 1936, the Nazi regime had rebuilt the Wehrmacht into a formidable force. Sleek divisions of panzers, precise formations of infantry, aircraft in silver ranks over parade fields. Yet beneath the spectacle, the Reich's industrial foundation was built on sand. Germany lacked almost everything required to sustain a long war. No natural oil reserves, limited access to rubber, copper, nickel or tungsten. Even iron and coal, abundant on paper, were unevenly distributed and inefficiently mined. Every bullet, every mile driven depended on imports and on access to the sea that the Royal Navy would soon close like a vice. To Hitler's planners, these shortages weren't obstacles, but deadlines. The four-year plan, launched in 1936 under Hermann Göring, aimed to make Germany autarkic, self-sufficient, by producing substitutes. Synthetic oil from coal, ersatz rubber from chemicals. Yet by 1939 the results were partial at best. Germany produced only about half the fuel it consumed in peacetime. Even before the first shot, the math was against them. Across the Channel, Britain commanded the sea. Across the Atlantic, American industry was waking. And deep in the Soviet Union, factories could be moved beyond the reach of any bomber. But Hitler's generals believed war could be short, sharp, and decisive. Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was an admission. Germany could not fight a long war of attrition, so it would fight a short one of movement. Fuel and ammunition would be concentrated for weeks, not years. The idea was to win before the system ran dry. When the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland in September 1939, this logic worked. At first, the front was narrow, the distance small, the rail lines intact. Trains brought fuel, horses hauled artillery, and columns of trucks carried men at speeds Europe had never seen. France fell in 6 weeks. The Balkans followed in a blur. Each victory seemed proof that speed could outwit supply, but speed was only a loan taken against the future. The deeper Germany advanced, the more fragile its logistics became. Behind the glittering tank divisions, thousands of horse-drawn wagons still creaked through mud and dust, feeding the illusion of mechanization. Inside the German high command, a few officers, logisticians, not heroes, warned of the limits. They pointed to fuel production charts, to overstrained rail lines, to synthetic fuel plants running at capacity before the main war had even begun. Their reports were filed away, marked not urgent, for now the Reich was winning. And victory, like adrenaline, masked the symptoms of exhaustion. Every army in history has marched on its stomach. But modern war demanded more. Oil for tanks, rubber for tires, manganese for steel, nitrates for explosives. Germany's enemies controlled nearly all of it. Britain's empire stretched from Africa to India. America's industrial base was a continent. The Soviet Union's resources lay deep beyond the Urals. Berlin's strategists convinced themselves that victory would unlock what they lacked. Conquer Poland, gain grain. Seize France, take coal and machinery. Invade the Soviet Union, capture oil and wheat. But every conquest added miles to the supply line, more mouths to feed, more divisions to supply. The machine was devouring itself. As 1940 turned to 1941, the illusion of control still held. The Wehrmacht stood poised for its greatest gamble, an invasion eastward that would stretch beyond the maps, into distances no German quartermaster could truly measure. The engines were ready. The rails were not. The Eastern Gamble, where distance defeated design, June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union, their confidence forged by lightning victories in the West. Their panzers advanced in 3 massive spearheads, supported by Luftwaffe bombers that ruled the skies. The German generals expected a campaign of weeks, perhaps months. They called it the War of Movement. What they began was a war of distance. At first, everything moved according to plan. Soviet border armies collapsed. Thousands of tanks were destroyed. Entire divisions surrounded. Hitler's map tables in East Prussia lit up with red pins marking victories. But behind the front lines, the rhythm began to slow. The farther east the German columns advanced, the more they left their lifeline behind. The Wehrmacht's supply system was built for Europe's west, dense rail networks, short hauls, paved roads. The Soviet Union offered none of this. The rails were wider, a different gauge entirely, and every kilometre of track captured had to be torn up and rebuilt before German trains could use it. The further the panzers moved, the more supplies had to switch from train to truck, and then, increasingly, to horse and cart. By September, the motorized divisions were running on fumes. The Blitz had slowed to a crawl. Fuel convoys couldn't keep up. Tires disintegrated on primitive roads. Engines froze overnight, then overheated by day. What had been a doctrine of movement turned into an exercise in endurance. The German army in 1941 still relied on 600,000 horses, more than in 1914. Their speed, their strength, their very presence contradicted the myth of a modern mechanized force. The panzers might have defined the headlines, but it was the horse that defined the logistics. Then came the mud, Rasputitsa. In autumn, the plains of Ukraine and Belarus turned into oceans of mud that swallowed trucks whole. Supply wagons bogged down axle-deep. Food spoiled. Artillery shells were rationed. Fuel dumps were set ablaze to avoid capture. Even before winter came, the supply lines were collapsing under their own weight. When the snows arrived, it was not strategy that stopped the Wehrmacht before Moscow. It was arithmetic. For every 100 tons of fuel needed at the front, only 30 arrived. Ammunition and food followed the same pattern. The remaining 70 tons vanished in transport, destroyed, delayed, or stuck on sidings hundreds of miles behind. At Stalingrad, a year later, these numbers would become a death sentence. The Sixth Army required about 800 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe could deliver at best 120 tons in good weather. When blizzards came, the figure dropped to near zero. Men froze, horses died, machines rusted in place. The German command demanded miracles. Logistics delivered the truth. While Germany struggled to move 1 ton east, the Allies were moving millions west. Across the Atlantic, the shipyards of New Jersey, Baltimore, and San Francisco worked around the clock. Every 3 days, a new Liberty ship slid down the ramp, 10,000 tons of steel, ready to carry food, fuel, and weapons across the ocean. By 1943, the Allies had turned transport into a weapon. Convoy systems, radar, and air patrols crushed the U-boat threat. The tonnage war reversed. Each month, Allied shipping outproduced German submarines 5-1. And while German synthetic fuel plants strained to meet military demand, American tankers and T2 oilers delivered more oil to Britain than Germany could refine in a year. Oil, the lifeblood of mechanized war, was now flowing one way, and it would soon decide every battle that followed. From 1943 onward, the war became a contest of logistics more than tactics. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, began to choke. Its pilots were skilled, but its tanks were dry. The great panzer divisions could still fight, but they could no longer move. Germany had designed an army for short wars. What it faced now was an industrial hurricane, one that spanned oceans and continents. The German generals would only grasp the full weight of this reality when the same problem that had broken them on the Volga came home to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. 3 years later, Angle 1, fuel, the true currency of movement by 1944. Fuel was no longer a resource in Germany, it was a crisis. The entire military machine that had once roared across Europe now sputtered toward collapse. From the start, Hitler's Reich depended on imported oil from Romania's Ploiești fields and on synthetic fuel derived from coal at plants in Leuna, Blechhammer, and Politz. Together, these sources barely sustained peacetime needs, yet the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine demanded ever more as the war widened. The arithmetic was merciless. A single panzer division consumed about 30,000 liters of fuel per day in combat. The Luftwaffe's daily operational demand reached 50,000 tons by 1942, but Germany's total monthly production hovered near 200,000 tons, and that was before the Allies began bombing refineries. In May 1944, American bombers struck Ploiești and Leuna simultaneously. The result was catastrophic. Within weeks, output plunged by 60%. By autumn, half the German Air Force was grounded not by damage, but by dryness. Training flights were cancelled. New pilots learned in classrooms instead of cockpits. Tanks were moved by rail to conserve diesel. Entire divisions became static. Meanwhile, the Allies had mastered the opposite equation. U.S. oil production reached 5.5 million barrels per day, and fleets of tankers ferried it unbroken across oceans. When Patton's Third Army ran low in France, it wasn't for lack of fuel in storage. It was a temporary transport issue quickly solved by the Red Ball Express. Germany could no longer imagine such a system. Fuel decided everything. Who could fly? Who could drive? Who could fight? And in the final years, the Wehrmacht learned that courage cannot move a tank without gasoline. Angle 2, rail versus road, the tyranny of gauge and distance. The German army prided itself on mobility, but its foundation was rail, not road. Every division's movement plan depended on trains delivering men, fuel, and munitions to depots near the front. Trucks handled the last 100 miles. This system worked in France, with its dense rail network. In Russia, it disintegrated. The Soviets used a broader track gauge, 1,020 millimeters, instead of the European standard 1,435. To operate captured lines, Germans had to tear them up and rebuild them, a process taking days per kilometer. Rail engineers, not soldiers, became the pace-setters of the campaign. Even once converted, the lines were vulnerable. Soviet partisans sabotaged bridges and switches nightly. German locomotives froze in winter, choked on dust in summer. The supply columns that depended on them turned increasingly to trucks. Yet Germany had fewer than 150,000 motor vehicles for an army that required 500,000. Each kilometer east added friction. Fuel spent delivering supplies reduced fuel available for battle. Roads turned to rivers of mud twice a year. Tires burst, engines overheated, axles snapped. What began as an army of speed became an army of stagnation. The Allies, in contrast, built redundancy into their networks. They standardized equipment, synchronized ports, and developed mobile depots. When they landed in Normandy, their railway engineers followed close behind, laying track even as the front advanced. Germany's logistical imagination never caught up to such scale. In the end, the tyranny of gauge became a metaphor for the tyranny of design. An army built for Europe's heartland, crushed by Eurasia's expanse, Angle 3, sea power and shipbuilding, the conveyor belt of victory. While the Wehrmacht fought over terrain, the Allies fought for movement. The Atlantic was their battlefield, and tonnage was their weapon. At the start of the war, German U-boats seemed poised to strangle Britain. By 1942, they were sinking Allied ships faster than new ones could be built. But then came the Liberty ship, a simple modular design that changed everything. American yards, using prefabricated sections and round-the-clock labor, turned shipbuilding into assembly line production. Each Liberty ship carried enough fuel, food, or tanks to equip an entire division. Between 1941 and 1945, 2,610 of them were launched, a floating bridge of steel from New York to Liverpool. With them came the T-2 tankers, the troop transports, and the landing ships that would carry invasion forces across every ocean. For Germany, this was an impossible feat. It lacked both the resources and the protected ports. The Kriegsmarine could no longer replace its losses, and its shipyards were increasingly under Allied bombs. The Battle of the Atlantic, once a duel, turned into an industrial avalanche. By 1944, Allied convoys were delivering 5 million tons of cargo per month to Europe. Behind every battle, from Normandy to the Rhine, stood that invisible sea bridge. Logistics had become global. And while Germany's tanks sat idle on snow-covered roads, Liberty ships churned endlessly through the waves, carrying the war forward. The myth of German invincibility was built on its battlefield prowess. But the truth, the one its generals realized too late, lay beneath the maps, in the arteries of supply that kept armies alive, the machinery behind the front, organization, air, and Allied integration. Angle 4, air logistics and air denial. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe seemed unstoppable. Its dive bombers shattered Polish columns, its fighters cleared French skies, and its transports carried troops across Europe in hours. But air power cuts both ways. It sustains and it starves. Nowhere was this clearer than at Stalingrad. When the Sixth Army was encircled in November 1942, Hermann Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped men entirely by air, a bold claim rooted in pride, not arithmetic. The Sixth Army required 800 tons of supplies each day. Even in perfect weather, the Luftwaffe could deliver only 300. In reality, it averaged barely 100. Snow, fog, and Soviet fighters turned every flight into a gamble. Pilots flew obsolete transport planes across hundreds of miles of contested airspace, often landing on icy runways under artillery fire. Each takeoff consumed precious aviation fuel that could never be replaced. Within weeks, the air bridge collapsed. From then on, air logistics became a fantasy Germany could no longer afford. By 1944, the Allies ruled the skies. Their bombers struck not just cities, but the sinews of war, marshalling yards, bridges, fuel depots, and synthetic plants. The U.S. 8th Air Force's oil campaign cut German fuel output by half within months. Every kilometer of railway was now exposed. Every daylight movement risked destruction. Trains hid in tunnels. Convoys drove only at night. Even the simple act of moving ammunition from one town to another required planning, deception, and prayer. The skies had turned from an ally to an enemy. Air superiority was no longer about combat. It was about control of time and distance. Germany lost both. Angle 5, leadership and organization. The German military machine was tactically brilliant, but strategically disorganized. Behind its efficiency on the battlefield lay chaos in its bureaucracy. Production, logistics, and procurement were divided among rival empires. The Army Ordnance Office, Göring's 4-year plan, Speer's armaments ministry, and a dozen private industrial cartels. Each fought for favor, resources, and prestige. Before 1943, coordination was nearly impossible. Factories produced weapons faster than the army could deliver them to the front, while ammunition and spare parts lagged months behind. Railcars sat idle because no single authority controlled routing priorities. Fuel was allocated by political influence, not by operational need. Albert Speer's appointment as armaments minister in early 1943 brought some rationalization. He streamlined production lines, introduced standardized designs, and pushed total war efficiency. Output increased even under bombing, but the fundamental constraint, raw materials and transport, remained unbroken. Germany could build tanks faster. It could not fuel or move them faster. Leadership at the top failed to grasp this distinction. Hitler's fascination with wonder weapons, jet fighters, rockets, super-heavy tanks, diverted men and materials away from the logistical backbone. Commanders at the front begged for trucks. Berlin gave them blueprints for giants. Meanwhile, Allied logistics staffs numbered in the tens of thousands, coordinating every ship, rail car, and convoy. Eisenhower's headquarters moved supplies like chess pieces across continents. German staffs, by contrast, were shrinking, overworked, underinformed, and crippled by Hitler's insistence on personal control of every detail. When the tide turned, it wasn't because the Germans forgot how to fight. It was because they never learned how to manage a war of systems. Angle 6, Lend-Lease and Allied integration. No single factor symbolized Allied logistical superiority better than Lend-Lease. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped over 17 million tons of material to its partners: weapons, trucks, rails, food, fuel, and even entire factories. For the Soviet Union, these shipments were lifelines. More than 400,000 American trucks, Studebakers, Dodges, GMCs, turned the Red Army from a foot-bound force into a mobile juggernaut. Locomotives and rails rebuilt Soviet transport after German occupation. Millions of tons of canned meat, boots, uniforms, and communication cables flowed through Persian and Arctic routes. These weren't luxuries, they were logistics. Every truck in Soviet service freed a Soviet worker to build tanks instead. Every can of American food meant a Russian train could carry ammunition instead of grain. The Western Allies also integrated supply at a scale unseen before. British ports, Canadian convoys, and American industry functioned as one organism. Shared standards of fuel, ammunition, even packaging meant parts built in Chicago fit vehicles in London and aircraft in Normandy. Germany, by contrast, stood alone. Its allies, Italy, Hungary, Romania, drained resources rather than providing them. There was no shared logistics network, no unified doctrine, no redundancy. The Axis fought as separate armies. The Allies fought as one system. By 1944, the result was visible from orbit, if satellites had existed then. A river of steel flowed west to east, uninterrupted, while Germany's veins ran dry. By the time 1944 arrived, the war was no longer about battles or generals. It was about the simple question every soldier now asked when engines coughed and trains stalled: can we move? Stalingrad, the arithmetic of defeat, January 1943. The frozen city on the Volga had become a graveyard of divisions, tanks, and illusions. For 6 months, the German Sixth Army, once 330,000 strong, had fought, starved and frozen within the ruins of Stalingrad. The rifles had long since rusted in their owners' hands. The cannons were silent, and the last functioning vehicles were used not for attack, but for burial details. The story of Stalingrad has been told in many ways: bravery, fanaticism, sacrifice. But beneath every tale of valor lay a quieter, deadlier truth. The defeat was not tactical. It was logistical. When Soviet forces encircled the city in November 1942, the Wehrmacht's greatest fear became reality: isolation without supply. The ring closed with mathematical precision. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin across half of Europe, was ordered to maintain the Sixth Army by air. Goering assured Hitler it could be done. The numbers said otherwise. To sustain 330,000 men in combat, 800 tons of supplies were required daily: fuel, food, ammunition, medical equipment, and winter clothing. The Luftwaffe could deliver at most 500 tons under perfect weather, and with unopposed skies. Over Stalingrad, there were neither. The result was a death spiral of arithmetic. Every sortie burned fuel that had to be flown in. Every destroyed aircraft reduced the next day's tonnage. Snow buried airfields, and Soviet artillery turned runways into craters. On December 20th, the airlift managed just 70 tons, less than 1/10 of what was needed. By Christmas, rations were down to 200 grams of bread per man. Horses were slaughtered for meat, their bones boiled into soup. Tank crews stripped wiring from their vehicles to make fire for warmth. Ammunition dwindled to a few shells per gun. Hospitals overflowed with frostbite, dysentery, and despair. Outside the pocket, the relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, struggled forward under General Hoth. But his panzers could barely move. Fuel shortages crippled the advance long before Soviet resistance did. Hoth's tanks ran out of gasoline within sight of the encirclement line, forced to withdraw after advancing less than 50 kilometers. Inside the city, Paulus sent one last radio message to headquarters, supplies exhausted, troops at end of strength. Hitler responded by promoting him to field marshal with an unspoken order. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. On February 2nd, 1943, Paulus defied that tradition. The Sixth Army ceased to exist. Of the 330,000 men who entered Stalingrad, fewer than 90,000 surrendered. Only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. Historians have studied the battle for generations, but the real verdict lies in a simple equation. The Soviet Union could move 25,000 tons of supplies per day along its rail network to the front. Germany could move less than 5,000. The Luftwaffe could deliver less than 100. The balance of power had shifted from courage to capacity. Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was a revelation. The first time the German High Command saw that operational brilliance meant nothing when measured against industrial arithmetic. Tanks and men could be replaced. Railways, oil fields, and refineries could not. As the last radio signals faded from Stalingrad, one message lingered longer than any order. The army was not beaten by men, but by math. The generals knew it, even if Hitler did not. Yet within 2 years, they would repeat the same gamble. Another offensive, another hope for surprise, another plan drawn in ink but not in fuel. The next time, it would not be on the Volga, but in the snow-covered forests of Belgium. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last gamble of fuel, December 16th, 1944. Before dawn, thunder rolled through the forests of Belgium. It wasn't weather, it was artillery. The ground shook as more than 1,500 German guns unleashed their fury on the thin American lines of the Ardennes. For a moment, it seemed as though the ghosts of 1940 had returned, panzers roaring westward, columns of infantry advancing under cover of fog, surprise and momentum on their side. Hitler called it Wacht am Rhein, the watch on the Rhine. To his generals, it was a desperate throw of the dice. The plan was audacious: break through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. Success might buy time, or even force a political settlement. But there was a fatal variable baked into the plan: fuel. From the start, the offensive ran on hope more than gasoline. The Wehrmacht had scraped together about 4.5 million gallons of fuel for the operation, just enough for the opening thrust. The rest was to be captured from Allied depots along the way. German tanks would have to fight toward their next refill. It was the same arithmetic that doomed Stalingrad, now played in reverse, on paper. The German armored divisions, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich and the 5th Panzer Army under Manteuffel, still looked formidable. In reality, most units were understrength, short on spare parts and running engines long past overhaul. Logistics officers warned that 1/3 of the tanks would fail before contact. Hitler ignored them. The first days went well. Fog blinded Allied aircraft, giving German columns the cover they needed. American units were caught off guard. Towns like St. Vith and Clairvaux fell. The 150th Panzer Brigade even used captured U.S. uniforms and vehicles to sow confusion. But behind every advance, fuel trucks were emptying faster than they could be replaced. Each kilometer gained burned another future kilometer. The 2nd Panzer Division, spearheading toward the Meuse, reported only enough fuel for one more day of movement. Crews siphoned from wrecks, drained abandoned trucks, even bled fuel lines from captured Shermans. By December 23rd, the weather cleared, and the Allied air forces returned. From that moment, the offensive began to die. Thunderbolts and typhoons pounced on convoys, turning roads into infernos. Fuel depots burned. Bridges collapsed under bombing. The German columns, stretching through narrow forest roads, became traffic jams of steel. One of the most infamous incidents occurred near Stavelot, where Kampfgruppe Piper, a spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, captured a large American fuel dump. But Piper's tanks could not carry it away. The drums required transport vehicles he didn't have. The fuel was destroyed as Allied units counterattacked. His advance ended with engines dry and guns silent. The offensive reached its high water mark near the village of Celle, less than 10 miles from the Meuse. There, on December 24th, the last German tanks ran out of fuel. Crews abandoned their vehicles and continued on foot. The battle was over, though the fighting would drag on for weeks. The numbers tell the story. During the Ardennes offensive, the German army consumed an estimated 11 million gallons of fuel, but had only 6 million available. Allied logistics, by contrast, were staggering in scale. 28,000 trucks of the Red Ball Express ran continuously from Normandy to the front, carrying 12,000 tons of supplies daily. While German tanks sat stranded, American depots had reserves enough to fuel multiple armies for months. The Allies had mastered the science of movement. Germany was fighting on mathematical credit, and the bill had finally come due. By January 1945, the offensive had collapsed completely. The snow was filled with the blackened hulks of panzers, silent monuments to a plan undone by arithmetic. Thousands of German soldiers trudged eastward, leaving their lifeless machines behind. Hitler blamed the weather, his generals, even fate. But inside the Wehrmacht's surviving headquarters, a grim understanding took hold. This was not a defeat of tactics or courage. It was the triumph of logistics. In the forests of the Ardennes, the same truth whispered through the smoke that had spoken at Stalingrad. Fuel is strategy, and supply is destiny. From this final gamble, there would be no recovery. The Reich had run out of time, metal, men, and most fatally, movement. The collapse of Germany's war machine, when the wheels finally stopped turning. Spring 1945. The roads of Germany were filled not with advancing columns, but with retreating ghosts. The once formidable Wehrmacht, an army that had conquered from the Channel to the Caucasus, was now a shattered procession of men on foot, pushing handcarts, dragging wagons, leading skeletal horses. Tanks rusted where they had stalled. Aircraft sat wing-deep in mud, useless without aviation fuel. The war machine that had stunned the world in 1939 had literally run dry. By this stage, the numbers told a story of mechanical collapse. In 1944, German refineries had produced roughly 180,000 tons of aviation fuel per month. After the Allied oil campaign intensified, output fell to 30,000 tons by autumn, a decline of 83%. Leuna, Berlin, Blechhammer and Pollitz were bombed repeatedly. Storage tanks burned for days, their black smoke stretching across the horizon. The synthetic fuel miracle that Goering had once promised could no longer even power the vehicles needed to defend the homeland. Rail transport, the arteries of German movement, was in ruins. Allied bombers targeted not just industrial plants, but the connective tissue between them. In February 1945, a single raid on Dresden destroyed 27 key rail junctions. Elsewhere, bridges collapsed into rivers, leaving freight cars stranded on either side. Repair crews worked under fire, patching one track while the next was already being destroyed. Trains moved only at night and at crawling speed. Even then, locomotives were short of coal. The effects rippled across every branch of the armed forces. The Luftwaffe could no longer mount coordinated operations. Sorties dwindled from thousands per month to mere hundreds. Experienced pilots were grounded, their aircraft cannibalized for spare parts. The Kriegsmarine's U-boats lay immobilized in harbors, unable to refuel. Panzer divisions were panzers only in name, often reduced to a handful of working vehicles surrounded by infantry on bicycles or horseback. Inside Germany, civilians felt the collapse as hunger and paralysis. Food trains never arrived. Coal shipments froze in sidings. Cities burned without water pressure to douse the flames. By April, entire regions lived off scavenged potatoes and rumour. Logistics, the invisible architecture that sustains both armies and nations, had disintegrated. Yet the record shows that even amid defeat, some German officers understood what had happened. Reports from the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, in early 1945 read less like military dispatches and more like accounting ledgers. Fuel situation critical. Only 14% of requirements met. Real network west of Rhine. Non-functional. Ammunition. Deliveries reduced to 20%. These were not tactical notes. They were death certificates. Meanwhile, the Allies advanced not only with overwhelming manpower, but with a logistical rhythm that seemed unstoppable. The Red Ball Express had evolved into a continental conveyor belt. Depots sprawled from Normandy to the Rhine. Portable harbors fed entire armies. Pluto, the undersea pipeline across the Channel, pumped fuel directly from England into Europe. On the Eastern Front, Soviet trains rolled on American locomotives, fed by Lend-Lease diesel and American grain. The contrast was absolute. One side was running out of geography. The other was running out of gasoline. And as the last German units withdrew toward the Elbe, even the most loyal commanders recognized a truth too long denied. The war had not been lost in the fields or in the air. It had been lost in the ledgers. The army that once moved with lightning speed was now a nation of pedestrians. The reckoning, lessons written in ledgers and ruins. By the time Berlin lay in ashes, the verdict was already written, not by generals but by accountants. The war that had begun with promises of lightning victory ended with numbers that no amount of propaganda could disguise. From January to April 1945, Germany's total monthly oil production fell below 10,000 tons, barely enough to keep trucks moving between cities, let alone fuel tanks or aircraft. Army records from that spring reveal a haunting rhythm of scarcity. No movement today, fuel exhausted. Withdrawal postponed, horses too weak. Abandoned equipment, 247 vehicles. The Reich had turned into a graveyard of machines. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later admitted that by late 1944, every operation, every plan, every hope depended on transport. His factories could still build guns and tanks faster than before, but the railways could not deliver them, and the refineries could not power them. In his memoirs, Speer wrote a simple sentence that stands as an epitaph for the German war effort. We could produce weapons. We could not move them. The Wehrmacht's commanders, too, came to the same realization. General Heinz Guderian, architect of the Blitzkrieg, had built his career on the principle of speed. But in his final war diary, written in April 1945, he recorded the bitter irony. The army that once prided itself on mobility can no longer move. Our strength dies on the roads. Behind those words lay a century's worth of military transformation. The age of the horse had given way to the age of the engine, and engines drink oil. When the oil stops, so does the empire. The Allies, meanwhile, demonstrated what integrated logistics could achieve. In France, engineers built over 2,000 miles of pipelines and repaired 5,000 bridges within months. The U.S. Army's Transportation Corps handled more tonnage per week than the entire German rail system at its peak. British, American and Canadian units operated as one coordinated machine. Where German command fractured between rival agencies, the Allied systems synchronized like clockwork. The consequences extended beyond the battlefield. When the war ended, Allied planners studied not just strategy, but supply. They found that tonnage, the ability to move and sustain forces over distance, had been the single most decisive factor. It was this realization that shaped the modern military age. Logistics as the core of warfare, not its servant. For Germany, the lesson came too late. The empire that sought to dominate a continent collapsed under the weight of its own shortages. Its grand strategy had been designed by soldiers, not by logisticians. And in modern war, that is a fatal mistake. Even in surrender, the remnants of the Wehrmacht marched in silence, not defeated by an enemy's sword, but by its own arithmetic. Across Europe's shattered landscape, thousands of tanks stood rusting in fields. Trains lay derailed beside cratered bridges. Fuel drums sat empty in the mud. These relics told the same story without words. Power without supply is only noise. The final staff report sent to Hitler's bunker in late April contained no strategy. No hope, only figures. Fuel reserves, Berlin sector, 2,700 litres. Motor transport, operational 14%. Rail movement east of the Elbe, impossible. That was how an empire ended, not with a final battle cry, but with a missing convoy. From the ashes of those ledgers, a new understanding of war would rise, one built not on dreams of invincibility, but on the cold logic of supply, transport, and time, the silent victor, how logistics won the war. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the victors stood not only on battlefields, but on bridges, docks, and railheads. The Allies had conquered not just territory, they had conquered movement itself. Every bullet fired, every tank that reached the front, every meal eaten by a soldier on the line was a triumph of logistics. The unseen war beneath the war. For Germany, that truth arrived too late. Its armies had fought with ferocity unmatched, its weapons were often superior, its soldiers disciplined and courageous. Yet they marched in the shadow of an illusion that willpower and tactics could overcome the laws of arithmetic. In the end, the equation was simple. The side that could move, feed, and fuel its armies longer would decide history. Logistics does not inspire monuments. It does not march in parades. There are no medals for the men who built bridges in the rain, who loaded crates in the dark, who repaired rails under fire. Yet it is these invisible victories that determine the visible ones. The wars of the 20th century proved that bravery and strategy, without supply, are only moments, but logistics endures. After 1945, every army, every nation that studied the ruins of Europe reached the same conclusion. Tanks, planes, and guns are tools. Fuel, transport, and coordination are power. Wars are no longer won by the sharpness of a blade, but by the flow of a convoy. And so when the snow fell once again over the Ardennes, covering the burnt shells of German armor and the empty fuel drums left behind, it buried more than machines. It buried an idea that glory alone can sustain an empire. The generals of Germany had learned too late what their ledgers had whispered all along. Logistics. Not guns wins wars. Wars are remembered for battles, but they're won by logistics. If you learned something new today, help us keep history alive. Subscribe for more untold WW2 stories. Just like the video, to support long-form historical documentaries. Comment below. Do you think modern wars are still decided by logistics? Every like, share, and comment keeps real history from being forgotten.